Hello there, and welcome to the new and improved Skul the Hero Slayer tier list. This is focusing on the post 1.4 update, the big revamp, where quite a few skulls got a big overhaul, and some others got some nice tweaks and quality of life changes. I'm going to begin by saying that some of the skulls didn't receive very major changes whatsoever. In fact, they got very minor changes, and an example is going to be my first placement, Alchemist. Alchemist getting dropped back into S tier. Now, Alchemist, I think, was actually skipped almost entirely in the notes. I don't even remember if he got anything. What I do know is that whatever was changed isn't significant enough to change his placement. Alchemist is in S tier dominantly due to Flame Flask. It is one of the most powerful buttons in the entire game, period. Like, it's that good, and if you've seen my Flame Flask Alchemist runs, it just becomes ridiculous. I'm not going to sit and linger on the skulls that didn't get many changes for too long. I want to move on to the ones that got the majority of the changes. So Alchemist is in S tier. We already knew that. Let's move on to the next, which is going to be, if I can find him, Sword. Now, Sword also didn't receive many changes. In fact, Sword mostly just got some small balancing stuff. Swordblade Slash got a small nerf. All of his other abilities got a small buff, but Sword is still in A tier, much like he was in my previous video. He is a very, very, very solid magic skull now, even more so that the rest of his kit is all magical, so it's even easier to build him. Moving on again, let's move to someone who actually got a pretty noticeable change. My favorite skull in the entire game, Archlich. Now, Archlich is a little bit, in the middle for some people. Some say that he got nerfed pretty badly and that he's dropped down from S tier. Some say that the nerf didn't really do much to him at all. For those who aren't aware, his Death Trap, previously called Seal, is now a baked-in ability that has a internal cooldown, basically. You can't spam Death Trap anymore by getting Infinite Bone or reducing the cooldowns of his abilities. It is similar to, say, Fighter/Champion's Golden transformation form. It's something that's not in your control as to how fast you get it back. So there are a finite amount of death traps that he can throw out at any given time. And to some people, this breaks him and makes him not as good as he used to be. For me, I don't care. It's still death trap. It still does dumb damage. And his other abilities are also good. In fact, this just lets us appreciate the others even more. He still has one of the only abilities in the game that can outright slow bosses and enemies within it, as well as just has some very powerful attacks. Let's be real, Archlich is not going anywhere. Next up on the list, just getting through quickly, we have Bomber. Now, Bomber didn't really get too much done to him. He is still A tier, still one of the best support skulls in the entire game. You can play him as a dominant upfront boomstick, quite literally. Or, as I like to play him with the Kaboom ability, you can have him as a secondary skull that only helps to enable your dominant skulls swap out and swap in abilities and features even more. If you have skulls similar to Reaper who like to swap in to get that guaranteed soul reap from killing enemies, or if you have ones like Shield who like to get a bubble shield when they swap out and back in, it can be really, really good for enabling effects and abilities that trigger on swap, which moves straight into the next skull on our list, who loves the swap. We are pulling in Mummy. Now, I'm not sure exactly where I want Mummy to go between A and B, because Mummy did, in fact, receive some nice changes. However, I'm thinking Mummy might be our first B tier in this new list, which is exactly the same as where Mummy was before. Now, despite getting some new toys to play with, I think Mummy got 3 new guns. Out of those 3 new guns, they're all very, very good, but I don't think any of them necessarily go far and above what he already had in his kit before. What they did do is make it a lot easier to get the weapons in the first place, because it was a bit of a struggle until you got to Legendary and then started to actually see weapons roll in. Now it's easy to get your weapons, but at the same time, they didn't receive too many changes in terms of how they themselves are used. So the rockets are still really good. The flamethrower is still ridiculous, still probably his best gun in the entire game, provided that you get a couple of the enabling items like gunpowder and Thieves' Black Steel Dagger and stuff like that. But the new weapons are good, in particular the homing missiles that actually zip around and find targets. That's very good as well. But I don't think it's quite enough to put him up in A tier just yet. It still can be a little bit touch and go as to what weapon you get and how you can use him. But I still think it's fair to put him in B. Next up, another A tier that didn't receive many changes at all. In fact, I think he was skipped entirely. Clown. He is still in A tier, still for the same reasons, has an incredibly fast attack, functions very well in madness builds, functions very well in high physical damaging builds, as well as cooldown reduction. Pretty much, you name the build, he can do it. He can even do full magical builds, which I have done before. It's a dumb meme, but sure enough, he can do them. I mean, Clown is actually a jack of all trades, not a joker. He is a jack of all trades, can do basically anything, and does it very well. Next up is kind of a sore one for me, and that's Recruit, who I'm actually going to drop down into B tier. Now, Recruit did see some pretty significant changes and a big overhaul to the way that he wants to play the game. His cooldowns for his summoning abilities were reduced to be shorter, but at the same time, the duration of those summons is shorter, so they don't stay around as long, but you can keep bringing them out more often, so it kind of tries to balance itself a little bit. But at the same time, they've now made it so that he has a higher focus on his charged concentrated slashes, as they now will buff your party. Once you build up his meter, you can activate his buff, and the dudes that you've summoned, all of his little soldiers, get a power up. What this does is encourage Recruit to, instead of running around in a circle, staying away from enemies and just spam summon dudes and play runaway, now he wants to get in the fray and actually do attacks and fight along with his men like a real leader, a true sergeant, a true king, charging into the thick of battle. The only problem is concentrating abilities are kind of hit or miss, and Recruit to me is a big miss. He doesn't do nearly enough damage on his own. His summons still don't feel like they're doing enough. There was a bug early on when they weren't benefiting from item effects properly. They weren't triggering effects properly. They have hotfixed these, but to me, Recruit still feels weaker than he was before the update. And I'm not entirely sure if there was some secret number tweaks going on or what, but he's definitely feeling a little bit on the weaker side to me, and he is our first Skul, I believe, that has been demoted. He used to be A tier. I'm leaving him in B now. Now, let's move on to one of the biggest success stories in this entire update. I'm talking Water Skul. Water Skul is getting dropped right in up at S tier. In the previous list, before the update, he was in C tier. One of the worst skulls in the game. He was in like the top 7 to 5 skulls for being the worst in the game. And now, he is up here in S tier as one of the best. Quite simply, the changes they made were simple, yet incredibly effective. His physical attack is now magic, so his basic is doing proper magic damage, which is something that a few other skulls share with him. At the same time, they changed the way that his little waves work when it's his main gimmick. His waves, as he fights, they come out and they push and pull around, and they were just kind of a nuisance before. They weren't working that well, and the devs acknowledged this, that it wasn't really doing what they wanted. Half the time they were pushing enemies away, and yet Water Skul wants to be up close and punch people. It's just counterproductive to what he wanted to do. Since the update, they've reworked some of his abilities, they've reworked his passive, and they've given him what feels to be a massive scaling boost to a lot of his attacks. He hits so hard now. He hits so incredibly hard, does huge damage. He is now one of the easiest skulls to build, while at the same time doing crazy stupid damage. And I'm actually going to put his brother-in-arms, Frost Skul, right up here in S tier right along with him, because they are both S tiers for basically the exact same reason. You can just slap a bunch of magic damage on both of them. Don't pay attention to mechanics. You don't need to worry about it. What they like to do happens automatically. You're not worried about building meters and spending them at the right time. No, these two will just do what they want to do. It's almost autopilot. Run forward, push buttons, use cooldowns, and great success comes your way. These two are both still in S tier. Frost Skul didn't receive many changes, by the way. That's why I'm just dropping him next to his buddy right now. Fighting together, both S tiers. It's amazing. Right, next up is actually one of the newer additions, because he wasn't in my previous tier list. He wasn't released at the time, and that is Grave Digger. Grave Digger was a release that came out after my last tier list, but people always ask me, where does Grave Digger and Monkey fit in? Now, Grave Digger did receive a pretty sizable change, that being that he's no longer a physical skull, he is now an all-magical skull, which was a bit of a surprise to a few people, but at the same time, I think they mostly wanted to separate Recruit and Gravy, as they are both summon archetypal kind of skulls, and they want one to be physical and one to be magical, because previously we had no magical summoners, which in a game that features a lot of necromancy seems a little bit silly. So this is effectively our necromancer now, little Gravedigger. And he is S tier. He was S tier before in the previous update, back when he was physical, and he's still S tier post-update in the new magical world that he lives in. So they did the same thing that they did with Recruit. They've tried to make it so that you can get your summons more frequently. So there's been some cooldown adjustments and duration adjustments. His summons don't last on the screen as long as they used to. They used to stay out for a long, long time. But in addition to that, his cooldowns got reduced. So it kind of balances out and just means that you can actually use your summons more often. You don't have to sit around feeling like you're not really pressing any buttons for long amounts of time like he used to. But overall, he was always S in my mind, and he's still S in my mind. Next up, we've got one of the fan favorites. We've got Rockstar. Now, I'm going to dump Rockstar in A tier, which may or may not bother some people. I know for a lot of you, he is effectively still an S tier, and I would agree, but so much of what he does is hindering on his band being summoned. Don't get me wrong, Rockstar has some of the most explosive burst damage in the game. He can nuke down enemies super quickly. Whole rooms gone, bosses gone. But it really does depend on the cooldown of his band. In addition to that, I just don't think he's pulling the consistency of the skulls that are currently listed in S tier. This is something that I want to do, is be a little bit more strict on why a skull is in high tiers. Is it for one button? Is it for one skill or ability? If they don't have that skill or ability, can they still function well? Which is why I'm saying now that Alchemist, even without Flame Flask, still does stupid damage. It's just not S+ tier degenerate. If you build Alchemist with any of his other flasks, it's still ridiculously good. Rockstar, on the other hand, if you don't have his band, he is still a good skull, very good, but I don't think he's S tier quality, which is why I think Rockstar wants to sit pretty comfy in A tier. They did do some adjustments for him. He is now an all magical skull. This is kind of like the big equalization update where a lot of the hybrid skulls got a true identity. Similar to Sword Skull, he's now all magic. Similar to Gravy, all magic. There's very few true hybrids left anymore, and Rockstar fits very snugly and nicely as an all magical addition to A tier. Next up, just to get him out of the way, we've got our little boy Skul, the main man himself, the protagonist. I'm dropping him in A tier. He was in A tier last time, and he's still in A tier. He received a small change in where he can no longer spam throw his head more than once before touching the ground. Now, some people call this a nerf. It actually isn't a nerf to his combat whatsoever. What it was a change to make it so that he can no longer wall climb, because people were able to use his throw head, catch head, repeat in order to scale walls and break boundaries, and you were actually able to skip some boss fights and cause some sequence breaks by doing this, and even in some small cases mess up your game and make it very difficult to get back to the start screen. So they wanted to make that change, I'm assuming for all of these above reasons, because he's been doing this for a long time now, and it just doesn't seem right that they would make that change out of the blue unless it was inspired by people doing boundary breaks. But his combat is exactly the same. His combat is exactly the same as it was before. The throwing head once in the air thing doesn't really change anything, except if you are doing cheesy fireball hunter's boots cheese strategies like I've shown off in the past before, which they are fun, but they're actually not very efficient for doing lots of damage. It's very safe, but not efficient. If you want to do big damage, you want to get up nice and close and spam that skull toss right in their face, which is why he is still in the A tier. He can still have some incredible builds, good damage. His swap has got a buff to his swap. The spin's got a buff. I didn't expect that. I'm glad that the spin's got a buff. People sleep on the spin. The spin is good. Don't sleep on this. A tier, he's very good. Next up, Shield Skull, who I like to say is one of the best skulls for anyone starting the game to try and get their first wins with. I often say that some of the best ways to learn the game is to build full defense. Just make a wall out of yourself and then learn what the enemies do. Get a chance to practice. For a lot of people, though, that chance doesn't come around because you die before you get a chance to really practice some enemies and boss fights. Shield enables you that practice. Shield lets you make mistakes because it's not super punishing every time you make one. Shield will absorb damage for you. Combine it with some good items that have also defensive properties to them. I'm talking Warrior's Pauldrons, I'm talking Dark Priest's Robe, Priest Staff, Knight's Determination, Wind Armor. Grab them, stick them on him, and he will effectively carry you to a fairly easy win, or at the very least, he will show you some new areas you've not seen before. Next up, we've actually got one that didn't receive many changes, but his main change is going to be his tier placement, and that's going to be Pike. Now, last time I stuck Pike in A tier because I just wasn't quite convinced that he could be good without his mad dashing builds that he was so known for. However, since then, I've done at least a dozen plus runs with Pike where I specifically and deliberately avoid all of the dash damage increasing items and effects, going so far as to avoid Kyrian, avoid Thorny Pauldrons. Just don't take any of those items. Can you play him as a dedicated Skul with just regular physical items and not have to be so niche with him? Because that was part of the problem before, was that you had to hunt down, like an Oberon style run, very specific items to really bring out the best in him. However, since doing these other runs, I can confirm Pike is just ridiculous. I don't understand what's going on with his scaling. It actually feels like common Pike is doing enough damage to be the equivalent of a unique Skul sometimes. He hits so hard, and it only gets better if you ignore the dash items and actually build him around full physical. If you get like high amounts of courage on him with some hope slasher stuff, he really does hit ridiculously hard. And because of that consistency, and you don't need to make him into a niche type of build, he's S tier. It's as easy as that. He just has too many tools in his kit that just work so well for him. Next up, we've got what I like to think of as one of the forgotten Skuls. People don't talk about this guy nearly enough. We're talking about Living Armor. Living Armor is coming in at A tier. He did get some minor adjustments to how his meter builds, in that it kind of builds a bit slower, but at the same time faster. It's kind of weird the way that the meter is building now. Some people think of it as a nerf. From my experience playing the new and improved Living Armor with his meter adjustments, not the case. I don't think he's been nerfed at all. He still builds his meter incredibly quickly. It's to do with his swap, by the way. When he swaps in, the meter doesn't build anywhere near as much. However, the major changes that he received pale in comparison to the most obvious change. His punches are now magical. Much like Water Skul becoming an all-magical envoy of wet, slippery darkness, the Living Armor is now full-on Flame Fist to the face, fire damage, it's magical, blue flame, magic, and it's fantastic. And it means that he scales in damage so much more. It is no longer a chore to run up and punch enemies to build meter. Before, you wanted to build him with Bomber. You needed someone else to take the heat while he swapped in and out to build meter. You didn't want to punch people. It was disgusting. It felt bad. However, now, I love punching people on my Living Armor. I want to punch more people. In fact, I'm looking forward to punching people later if I get him in a run. A tier. He hasn't moved. He is still in A. He is still good. Set the whole room on fire. Now, next up is a weird one. We have Gargoyle. Now, previously, Gargoyle, he has a bit of a weird history. He was originally my first D tier pick in the original tier list, and then he got bumped up to C tier in the update because his evolutions genuinely weren't that bad. Now I'm going to bump him up again. He's slowly climbing up from D tier. Trash Goyle tier no longer exists. C tier, yeah, we're going to climb up a little bit higher into B. So the reason for this is that he did get a lot of changes to how his abilities work. He's still a bit of a hybrid Skul. There's still some hybridization that you can do with him if you really want to. However, a lot of people, and myself included, seem to find that going just full magical damage is just the way to go with his claws, his lasers, his wind gusts. There's just a lot that can be done there. However, he still does feel kind of clunky and doesn't feel like he does enough damage as of right now. It can be really hard to try and maintain elevation using his kit against some boss fights, namely the hero, also the sisters, because you're trying to do damage and stay airborne so that you can get his passive buff to damage by staying in the air for long amounts of time. It can, yeah, for lack of a better word, it's clunky. It still feels like it needs a little bit of, work, a little bit of baking in the oven maybe. However, I like the direction that they're going in. I genuinely think that he might be maybe 1 or 2 good updates away from being a perfectly well-rounded Skul. For the most part, he does feel good when fighting rooms, like waves of enemies. If you get a big cluster of enemies together and you shoot some lasers and throw some tornado stuff across the screen, it's very satisfying. However, I can't ignore the slight drawbacks in that he just doesn't perform that well in some other areas of the game, so I'm gonna have to leave him in B tier for now. Next up, also joining in B tier, I'm gonna be dropping in Stone Monkey. This is the second Skul along with Gravy that came out after my last tier list, and I had people all asking me, where is Stone Monkey gonna fit on a tier list? And I've said for the longest time, he's probably either a low A or a high B. If I had a B plus or an A minus tier, that's where this guy'd probably go. He used to be kind of broken. He had a bug involved where he could one-shot just about any boss in the entire game. In fact, and he did actually one-shot every boss in the entire game when built correctly. However, they quickly nerfed that. And since then, he's just never quite recovered from that nerf. He does good damage. He's very solid. He's like the perfect example to me of a B tier Skul. He has good movement, he's got a good basic attack, he's got good passive mechanics with summoning all the clones, which as you progress through evolution, they start doing more for you. Everything feels okay, however, his skills have a concentration effect built in, where if you want to get the most out of them, you got to hold the button in, which of course risks you getting hit. It's one of the chief complaints I have about concentration, is that it's a very risk-reward style system, and for a Skul like Monkey who wants to get in someone's face and fight up close, very fast and speedy, you can tell that speed is just baked into this guy's whole motif. It's his whole existence is to get around the screen fast, summon clones, smack, smack, get the job done. And to slow it all down by having him concentrate to increase the size or damage of his attacks doesn't feel very good half the time. I take more damage doing concentration abilities than if I just tap the button and do a basic version of it, or just do basic attacks. So in the meantime, Monkey's gonna sit in B tier. Not bad, also not stellar. Perfect example of a middle-of-the-road B tier Skul. Someone who's very similar to Monkey, but is just a little bit better in just about every possible way, is Thief, who is coming up into the A tier. Now, Thief to me really is, I think of him like the improvement upon Monkey. Thief is able to do Madness just that little bit better due to his passive coins trait. Thief is able to do really strong physical builds, but at the same time, Thief also has access to some incredibly powerful magical builds. This is because Thief is a hybrid Skul. He's somehow managed to hold on to his hybrid skill set. I figured by now they were going to make him all one or the other, but I'm actually glad they haven't. I think Thief being a hybrid Skul suits him very well. The smoke bomb and coin toss being magic, and his backstabs and what in the world is the other ability I'm not thinking of? Either way, he's got physical and magical. I can't think of the other abilities besides backstab. In any case, he works incredibly well with all of the dominant builds in the game. You can actually build him with Oberon because of his magical kit. You can build him full magic, full physical, madness, big crits, cooldown reduction, and he also has the luxury with his smoke bomb ability of having one of the only abilities in the game that can give you a decent amount of proper invincibility that doesn't restrict your movement. You're looking at Hibernation in Frost Skul and the Stone Form Gargoyle ability, I forget what it's called, for Gargoyle, that both make you impervious to damage but also restrict your movement. You can't do anything, you're basically a rock in the meantime. Thief doesn't get that. He can drop a smoke bomb down and still fight, and does very well at this, and because of this, having things like infinite bone or lots of cooldown reduction can lead to a lot of people getting their first no-hit achievements on some boss fights, because you drop the smoke bomb down, go in with the coin tosses, he can do some insane damage and not get hit while doing it. It's a very good kit. Next up, we have Werewolf. Simply put, still S tier. People thought that he got a major nerf with his jumping attack being toned down a bit, because beforehand it used to hit multiple times in the air. It is the speedrun favorite, and I still think he is the speedrun favorite. Some people say that his nerf to his attacks kind of killed him, but that's from a very, very, very high-end speedrunning perspective. It slows him down, that's all it does. It does not stop him from doing insane damage. It does not stop him from having Hunt, which is one of the most broken abilities in the game, literally adding a multiple times multiplier of damage on the opponent of how much damage they can take. You can start slapping people so hard once you put Hunt on someone. In addition to the Beast Sleep, which is still one of the fastest moving and best damaging abilities that he has, he still, for some reason, has access to some hybrid stuff, but ignore all of that, right? Ignore all of that. Werewolf is still incredibly fast, incredibly strong. You can build him for madness and physical, you can do whatever you want with him. Being a little bit slower for speedruns does not change his placement in my tier list. I still think he's S. Move on. Now we're going to move straight into a few rapid fire ones. We're going to go with Berserker, who is mostly unchanged. Berserker is still in A tier, still exactly the same that he was before, still has fantastic damage. Transformation effect is still one of the coolest things in the game. Same builds, pretty much hasn't been touched. Berserker is still tried and true, one of the best power skulls in the entire game, especially aesthetically. He just, oh, so satisfying, dude. But Berserker is going to sit here in A tier, and accompanying Berserker, this is going to make people a little bit sad because it's technically a drop. We're going to put Dark Paladin in A tier. Now, this is mostly due to power creep, right? Dark Paladin works very, very well on his own, plays incredibly well on his own, but is also an incredible support Skul. This is dominantly what we see, from me at least, using Dark Paladin for whenever I find him, is as a secondary to any other magic build in the game. Dark Paladin shield that he can generate does trade over across swaps, so he can actually generate shields that stay on your secondary skull, as well as while that shield is active, it boosts their magical damage done. It just makes him a very, very good secondary. He's a good wingman for all these magical boys. However, these days, due to all the other skulls previously mentioned getting such a rise in power, I'm looking at water, gravy, even frost, these are the kind of skulls that can just obliterate rooms and do just obscene amounts of damage in very short amounts of time, very consistently, and that's the important part here. Very consistently. Now, Dark Paladin is all about consistency, but that damage isn't explosive enough. It doesn't elevate it to the next level. I'm thinking of Dark Paladin similar to how I'm looking at Rockstar and Living Armor, in that they all have their kits that they have that can either do really good burst damage but lower consistency, or have more consistency and lower burst damage. And I think that Dark Paladin kind of fits that nice even groove in A tier. While we're shooting through it, I'm gonna drop Predator back up here in S tier. Predator got virtually no changes whatsoever. Still spins, still slashes, still wins, still probably the best power skull in the game in terms of physical damage. Maybe we got a new contender coming up soon, but Predator still does insane work. What else can I say? He's always been one of the best, and he will probably always forever be one of the best, unless they just decide to cut his arms off and take away his swords. Next up is the champ, the champion himself, swinging into A tier. Champion surprisingly got a few changes, new abilities, in fact. Whole new abilities, a whole new kit, a whole new way to look at life and to play with life. Champion is now dominantly a 1v1 come at me bro style fighter. There is virtually nothing in his kit that hits more than one target at a time, which can make him feel very clumsy when dealing with rooms. You definitely want to have a secondary skull that is more adept at handling these rooms. You could take something like Berserker, Predator, any of the strong physical boys. Take Pike, for example. Pike can just dash through the room and just blow everyone up. But Champion excels at 1v1s, which means he is a dedicated boss slayer, and can do that very, very effectively. Shoutouts to Combo. It's one of the most satisfying abilities, right up there with Swordblade Slash. It feels very good to use. Unfortunately, a lot of his explosive boss-killing damage does come from overlapping effects. One, you want to swap into the boss or the target that you want to blow up in order to apply a debuff. You want to have his slow down time Super Saiyan Berserker mode transformation and be able to rapidly build or already have energy stored. He just has this kind of build it, spend it style of play, and sometimes he can feel very, very slow, especially if you do have to drag him through rooms of enemies like those large wave rooms. It can feel very, very difficult. However, with his new Dirty Smack, Dirty Punch, with his Dirty Punch ability, it actually offers one of the first times we've seen a command grab style ability in the game, which can interrupt iframe abilities on some of the enemies in the game, which means the yellow glow around them when they do an invincible attack can be interrupted by this. It treats it like a true stun, but even more so than a true stun. It does big damage at the same time. Very interesting mechanic that I hope we see more of in the future, but for now, Champion does his one job very, very well, but isn't good enough at his other jobs in order to rise up to S tier, so he stays in A. I am, however, pleased, so pleased to say that someone who is rising up into S tier is none other than the Grim Reaper himself. Last time, I created quite the kerfuffle, much contention, many angry letters. Not really, but I like to imagine that there were. I'm a big boy after all. I have lots of people who write to me. Reaper has made his way into S tier. Now, the changes that were made to Reaper addressed everything that I said in my previous video that held Reaper back. Reaper is a god at slaying rooms of enemies. His Will-O-Wisp ability that he used to have before the update just made it obscene in how he could just walk into a room, kill about 2 or 3 dudes, and then the rest of the room just kills itself, quite literally. Nowadays, though, they've reworked that into a magic increasing effect, they've boosted the amount of damage that he can do as a result, and they've even given him some new tools in his kit, and have ultimately just turned him into one of the most dominant snowballs in the game. We'll get to the other snowball later, but as far as magical damage goes, Reaper just starts building. And there is something important that needs to be mentioned, though. A lot of people are going to bring up, well, is this Reaper that you obtained early in the game or Reaper that you obtained later in the game? Now, I'm someone who will normally say if you find a skull in Act 4 and you're willing to swap out to it and take it, you've either had very bad luck in your skulls up to that point, or you haven't really had that much of an identity as far as what skull you wanted to use to begin with. Because for me, for the most part, if I get to, say, Act 4, and I've got some items and some skulls on me, I've kind of committed to the build. If Reaper shows up, I may not take him unless it's just to fill the slot of a secondary partner and maybe take advantage of some of his invincible abilities. That's about it. But for doing that, Reaper is still really strong. Now, yes, you do want to get Reaper as early in the run as possible. Act 2 is still fine. Even early Act 3, go for it. It doesn't matter that much. All you really need to be able to do is get 150 kills or more to boost his soul meter up so that he gets access to his final form abilities, the most powerful abilities that he can use. At that stage, he can run away with it. He really can just run away with it. He becomes a very powerful addition to the team, and I'm so glad that these changes have made him more effective at boss slaying. That was one of his biggest drawbacks. He couldn't take care of bosses that quickly. It made him the inferior between him and Lich, and now I'm pleased to say he can take his spot up in the S tier where he's belonged for a long time now. However, sadly, this brings us to another demotion, and that is, if I can do it, the Samurai. Samurai has been demoted from S tier down to A tier. It is a heartbreaker. It is an absolute heartbreaker. Previously, I had him in S tier solely for the Full Moon Slash, because, let's be honest, Full Moon Slash being able to one-shot everything on the screen, bosses included, was just too degenerate. It was too easy to set up, it was too powerful to do, it trivialized fights, it was insane. And for him to be an S tier on the merit of one ability, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. Which is probably why they decided to nerf Full Moon Slash and reduce its overall damage so that it doesn't scale as high anymore. That's right, we're not going to see 40,000 damaging Full Moon Slashes anymore. At least I don't think so, unless there's some shenanigans I can do. But in the meantime, he received that nerf. What they wanted to do was make it so that you don't rely as heavily on one button, very similar to what happened to Arclich with his Seal/Death Trap. So what they've done is they've rounded off the rest of what he can do so that his other abilities are still just as usable and just as strong, but bring down the damage of Full Moon Slash a bit so that you're not entirely focused on landing that big one-shot. Due to this, it actually balances him, which in turn means he becomes an A tier because he's not super gross disgusting and have easy access to broken stuff. I'm actually kinda happy for him being an A tier because him feeling more fair just feels good to me. Joining him in A tier is going to be his partner in crime, the Ninja. Ninja was previously in A tier, and for all the same reasons, to be honest, he did receive some changes, like being able to transform into an actual shuriken and fly around the screen. However, for a lot of players, it doesn't change how difficult it can be to control him. I would actually say that Ninja is the hardest skull in the game to physically, manually direct around the screen. Once you get in the air and you start doing all of his air dashes and air attacks and spamming all of his abilities on the ground and in the air, because he's very unique, he has different abilities on the ground and in the air. Very unique skull indeed. Very cool playstyle. However, if you train with him a little bit and practice and get used to it, he is a very, very solid damage-dealing skull. Very strong indeed. However, for a lot of people, controlling him puts you off, right? Like, understandable. It's why some people don't like power skulls, because it's a different way to move and different way to think about mobility and how to fight. Understandable. However, as it stands, he didn't receive a nerf. He's still exactly the way that he was before, if not maybe slightly better. I think he belongs in A tier. Just because I haven't done it yet, let's bring Prisoner, aka the King himself, up into S tier. Do I need to explain why Prisoner is in S tier? Have we not all seen so far why he belongs in S tier? He didn't get any changes. He wasn't nerfed. He should have been nerfed. He's still one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful skull in the entire game. I often argued before the update that Prisoner and Werewolf were both arguably tied as best skulls in the game. And Werewolf got a slight adjustment. He got a mini nerf. Prisoner got nothing. Does that mean Prisoner's just the best skull in the entire game overall? 100% the strongest boy? Maybe. I'm actually out on that one. He might be the strongest skull in the entire game. S tier. 100% S tier. In fact, he should be an S plus tier because that's just how good he is. He stays here. That's it. It's time to drop in another boy in the lower tiers, and we're dropping in Hunter. Now, this is going to be disappointing to some of you, and it's going to, like, rattle some bones. Haha, pun intended. But Hunter received one dominant change, and that was to his piercing shot ability. It used to do magical damage, made it very hard to use. It was the only magical thing he had, which means, you know, you could theoretically do a magic build, but you're only going to do damage with one button. The devs, rightfully so, saw this as being basically fruitless and a waste of an ability because no one wants him if he has that button, so they decided to make it physical. Great change. Unfortunately, and as many people often point out, Hunter doesn't do enough damage. Hunter, quite physically, just doesn't hit hard enough. I've built him with maximum chase, I've built him with maximum damage, loads of crit, put Orc on him to give some more damage, and it still doesn't feel enough. It's like you give him all of these items and effects, and it only brings him up to about the same level as your average A-tier skull like Clown, for example. Clown just inherently does so much more damage and plays so much more smoothly. I like Hunter's idea of being a true ranged skull that doesn't need to fight up close and has access to a lot of really cool attacks. Hunter at Legendary, by the way, is one of the coolest looking skulls in the entire game. He just is, and has access to some phenomenal looking abilities. Taking a bow and arrow and making it look sexy is difficult to do, and they've done that. However, his damage is what holds him back. It's nothing else. It's his pure damage. It doesn't matter how you build him. He just doesn't feel like he hits hard enough. So in the meantime, he's going to sit in C tier. If they decide to boost his scaling a bit and make him do more damage, he might rise to B or even A tier. We'll see what happens then. But for now, he's my first C tier. Moving along into the next, we have the Warlock. Now, Warlock is dropping into A tier, and I was honestly debating putting him in B, but I feel like that'd be a sin, and people would bring out their pitchforks and torches and start going off at me. However, I do believe that without the Meteor, Warlock kind of feels a little bit more on the lackluster side, because Warlock needs to charge up his abilities in order to do big damage, and it is big damage, but you have to remember that charge time while you're building up the meter to fire off his big attacks is time that other skulls and other characters are also doing their attacks. While Warlock is charging up his big explosive meteor attacks, skulls like Sword is in the middle of doing sword blade slashes and smacking dudes. Living Armor is building up his meter to fire off big flame attacks. Paladin has probably built a shield and a half by now, and Champion has already transformed into his ultimate form and started blowing up the boss. So I really did feel like, is Meteor enough? That's one ability. Does his beam make up for it? Does the gravity ball make up for it? Do the needles make up for it? Overall, I didn't want it to, but at the same time, I can't argue with the fact that he does do really nice damage. So even if you don't manage to find the Meteor, you can still make good use of the rest of his abilities. The beam works incredibly well for clearing rooms. The giant ball can work very well at killing bosses, in fact. If you can time that right, it becomes ridiculous. Also, very good room clear. Ultimately, he feels a little bit clunky. He's kind of similar to Ninja. For some people, he's not very intuitive and can be really difficult to pick up and get used to. But at the moment, he sits in A. He's dangerously close to being in B, right? The fact that he's in A is it's very close, very, very close. If he receives so much as a sneeze of nerf, he's falling into B tier. I'm warning you now, Warlock, don't get sneezed on. We have another skull dropping down from their previous placement. We have Ryder dropping into A tier as well. Ryder used to be in S tier, but for the same reason that other skulls are being reevaluated, Ryder was in S tier purely because of his bike, right? The bike. Now, thankfully, as opposed to skulls like Warlock, you do get access to the bike constantly, very similar to Samurai, very similar to Rockstar with his band. It is a baked-in thing that he can do. He can just get on the bike and run people over, and it does a lot of damage. Is it a little bit tricky to control? Yes, but that just takes practice. Once you get used to quickly spinning him in place so that you can sit on top of a boss for long periods of time, it becomes a lot easier to use, and you start to notice how much damage the bike really does do. But unfortunately, I don't like the idea of him being placed in S tier for that one ability alone. The majority of all of those S tiers are up there because they're really good at what they do regardless of one button. The only one that people are going to say is contentious is Alchemist because Flame Flask and all that, but I still maintain that Alchemist, even without Flame Flask, is overtuned. He does disgusting damage. Try it. It's dumb. For Ryder, however, the bike is sometimes a bit of a crush because if he doesn't have the bike, he kind of falls off and doesn't feel that good, which is why you want to build him around things like infinite bone and cooldown reduction while also building up his physical damage. He can be an explosive tactical nuke on enemies, but I just don't want him to rely exclusively on one button to be that good. He's also the victim of power creep as other skulls are getting better, like water. He just kind of sits there in the middle, still being good, but is suddenly you're noticing that maybe other skulls are showing off why Ryder's bike is a bit of a hindrance at times. Next up, we've got one that I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm going to be super honest with you guys. We have Gambler, right? Now, I'm going to stick Gambler in A for now. However, I will be completely honest with you guys. Out of my Gambler experience so far, I have not been able to get a hold of and test out the Roulette. People tell me the Roulette is why he belongs in S tier guaranteed. However, for the sake of this tier list, I can't put him there because this is based on my own experience with these skulls and my own playstyles and my own experiences with the game in general. However, yeah, like I'm saying, dude, I can't put him in S just yet. Until I get the Roulette, I can't condone it or do it. However, let's just say hypothetically that I've had the Roulette and I use the Roulette and it's a lot of fun. It does dumb damage. It just blows up the whole room and the boss dies and yada yada. He goes in S tier, right? Just humor me on this. He's basically an S tier skull that I haven't had a chance to see him being an S tier worthy skull firsthand. In the meantime, he's A tier, but let's just pretend he's in limbo, okay? Overall, talking about the skull, the changes to his mechanics, fantastic. The updates to his abilities, fantastic. I was going on about this in my most recent Gambler video. He never used to do damage. He used to be relatively weak and be a, little wet noodle, blah, 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 throw cards, no damage, nothing's coming out. Was he fun to play? Sure, but just wasn't satisfying because he wasn't killing rooms fast enough. He wasn't killing bosses. He had to rely on friends to help do the work for him. Now, he does damage. It's like how Reaper got a big damage overhaul, Gambler got a damage overhaul. He hits hard and it feels good, and I'm glad for him. Next up in the list of forgettables, much like Living Armor, we have the Genie. I'm gonna stick Genie in B tier. Genie didn't really receive enough or much of anything to make him better or worse, thankfully, so he's kind of staying in B tier along with where my most recent tier list was. I believe he was in B tier. I'm just going based on memory now. Genie to me is very forgettable. His physical damage isn't really high. He kind of suffers from low damage itis, similar to Recruit. And his abilities, while having the iframes, are also suffering from low damage itis. He does have an identity as a potential dash builder, with things like wind armor and the hunter's boots, similar to Pike. However, that's a budget dash build. The real dash build is Pike. Overall, Genie, he does stuff, but it's really not enough. He really is middle of the road, very similar to Monkey and Recruit. I'm happy with him sitting in B tier for now. Next up is the big boy Minotaur, and I'm gonna throw Minotaur in A tier. This is an upgrade, I believe, from the previous tier list where I had him in B. Now, Minotaur has received a little bit of an adjustment, like the most minor of tweaks. It's very, very minor, but at the same time, it does just elevate him that little bit more into A tier. But at the same time, I think about Minotaur and Genie sitting next to each other, and it's just a crime. So Minotaur definitely goes up into A. He is a very, very high damaging power skull, very similar to Berserker and Predator, and one that we'll come to later. He just does tremendous damage. Actually, it isn't that slow compared to other power skulls. Like, physically, he moves slow, and he actually has a 10% movement speed nerf just inherently by being who he is. But his abilities come out very fast. He doesn't have the slow, lumbering sword attacks that Berserker does. He has some pretty quick things. His lariat is so fast, dude. It's so incredibly fast. But every time I've played Minotaur so far, it just feels good. It feels comfortable. He feels solid. It doesn't feel like there's anything that he's particularly bad at or any areas that I think he absolutely needs an improvement on. And now we come to the final 4 skulls. And I've done this on purpose because these 4 skulls are some of the most dramatic changes in all of Skul, right? In all of the game. First and foremost, I've got another one that's probably going to bother some people, and that is Ant. Ant is climbing up into A tier, crawling his way from D tier all the way up into A tier. And by crawling, I mean exploding out of the earth like a rocket sent to the moon, because this is insane how well Ant plays now. I have been told by many people in the community that Ant is worthy of S tier due to some of the really stupid broken shenanigans you can get away with, especially with things like his giant fist with some orc, with some crit, one-shotting bosses, slap, big damage, much fun all round. The new grass mechanic on the ground, just sublime. What a fantastic thing to do. I'm a big fan of giving skulls even more identity in and of themselves, right? So similar to Ninja has more stuff in the air that he can do. Ent now has the grass on the ground. Gargoyle wants to stay airborne. I love these identities and unique mechanics that these skulls have that make them feel like their own thing. He's not just, oh, he's the tree-themed power boy who hits hard and has one dash. That's it. That's his identity. He's just tree-themed. Now he feels like he actually has stuff that he can do that no one else can do. The stretchy limbs, fantastic, amazing. I will say that Ent might be able to go up into S tier, but like I said regarding Gambler, this is all based on my personal experiences. I've had some really strong Ent runs, but nothing that screamed S tier just yet. It could change in the future, but I mean, let's be honest, Ent being an A tier is a triumph in and of itself. Now we're moving on into probably the greatest turnaround in all of Skul, right? I have never seen a Skul be able to go from D tier all the way to S tier. Literally, Warrior has pulled the greatest switcheroo. You think Rocket to the Moon was impressive? He's trans-dimensional. He just moved into a different timeline and said, in this universe, I'm S tier. That's it. He just decided to change his fate. Warrior was just simply the worst thing to touch before, dude. He was just not good. Him and Ent were both just trash. And thankfully, the Skul devs have given him one of the greatest tools that he could ever hope for. They barely did anything to his toolkit. It's mostly the same. The small addition of making it so that he's invincible while throwing his fully charged abilities is enormous. And pretty much everyone who's had a chance to experience this, who also understand why he was bad previously, are all in agreement that this is phenomenal. This is amazing. It feels satisfying. He's able to be defensive while being a power skull. It's one of their major drawbacks, power skulls, is that they're very slow. You've got skulls like Berserker who thrive in the knowledge that I'm going to take damage. I'm just going to throw myself out there. I'm hurting myself. You've got skulls like Shield who protect themselves. And you start to notice a pattern that a lot of the power skulls who do really well are either like Predator, not that power scully, you know, kind of atypical, or they have mechanics and gimmicks that cover up that little drawback. And Warrior's mechanic not only covers it up, but it accelerates it into goddom. Because not only is he immune to damage while throwing his attack, he actually absorbs hits. He absorbs them, and it powers up the strike that he throws. If you time this and throw one of his attacks out while multiple enemies are trying to hit you, or while a boss is doing a multi-hit attack on you, you can essentially come close to one-shotting, if not actually one-shot, if you've got the right build. He does absurd damage while not paying any life in the process, which is a trade that not many skulls can get away with. Even Arclich half the time might take a slap in the face while throwing out Death Trap. Warrior being able to do it for free, no risk involved, get more damage, actually try to hit me, dude, I thrive on this. It's just that good. It is the biggest turnaround I've seen in Skul so far. It is incredibly deserved. He's become one of my favorites. This change alone has made him one of my favorite skulls. Before, I would pretend that he didn't exist and spit on his grave. Now, I'm digging him up so I can play him some more. Come back to me some more, Warrior. I want to do more Warrior runs. It is that good. Go out there and try this. Get used to his new mechanic. It is broken, dude. It is actually broken. S tier. S tier. Now, next up is something that I hate. I actually hate this, dude. I really hate doing this, and it's Yaksha. I need to drop Yaksha in C tier to prevent me from dropping him down into D tier. So, I was hype. Everyone else was hype. We were all excited about the changes for Yaksha. However, even with the hotfix that kind of addressed some issues with him, it still doesn't feel good. It still feels lacking. He takes so much damage. I was just talking about how Warrior and Shield and all these other power skulls have an identity that can protect them despite the fact that they're power skulls. Water Skull's method is just doing big, dumb, stupid magical damage now, and he also has dive and a few mechanics. He can also fight at range with his waves going out. He's a truck, right? He just does big, big damage. Gravy, he can summon dudes to fight for him and run away if he needs to. Predator doesn't play like a power skull whatsoever. He may as well be a speed skull masquerading as power. You've got dudes like Shield Skull who have an absorption barrier effect and blocking. He literally just stops damage, much like how Warrior can just stop damage. Living armor, big screen AoE magical damage. You don't even have to get that close half the time. Punching is good, but you don't have to. Berserker takes the hits and gets stronger for doing it. It's just a case of, do they have something that helps them trade in the drawbacks? Now, Yaksha is probably the closest thing that I can compare to Minotaur, because they both have this kind of big burly bruiser, just run in and start swinging and hope for the best. Except at the very least, Minotaur does damage. Minotaur can slap a group of enemies and they all blow up and go away. Minotaur can slap a boss and take out big hefty chunks. Minotaur is just easier to build. Yaksha, despite the bloat of having this new transformation effect that you can transform into the Yakshasa and gain access to improved versions of his abilities, he still doesn't hit hard. I've had so many attempts with Yaksha now, 2 of them made into YouTube videos, and some that I've done on stream, some that I've found in private, where I've just tried my best to prove to myself and to everyone else, if you give him the right items and the right build, he can just be a phenomenal Skull. And it just isn't the case. He just doesn't hit hard enough. He needs like a 2 to 3 times damage boost put on him, just simply put. Like, he just doesn't hit hard enough. But even then, it doesn't hide the fact that he's very, very vulnerable. So many of his attacks in his Yakshasa form are delayed. They're so slow. He's got the multiple punching abilities. He's got the big slams. Some of these things just leave him so open and vulnerable in a way that it's like summoning a meteor as Warlock. You sit there for so long. At the very least, the meteor comes down and you have to be anywhere near the enemies for it to do damage. Yakshasa and Yaksha comparatively have to be in someone's face, and they're also a power skull with 1 dash, and they take a lot of hits. I swear I've been dying and having the hardest time trying to keep good life on Yaksha more than any other skull in the game. He really is just suffering so much, and the reason why he's in C and not in D tier is entirely down to the fact that he still does more damage than Hunter. Hunter can at least fight at range. Hunter can at least win runs. Hunter can at least feel satisfying with the right items. His main drawback is damage, and that's similar to Yaksha. Yaksha's main drawback is damage, which is probably why, if I was to order this properly, which this tier list is not ordered in any way, if I were to order it, I would say that Yaksha is worse than Hunter. I would take Hunter any day over Yaksha, because at the very least, I know I can avoid damage and do ranged damage back to my opponent and still perform well on Hunter, right? I'd rather do a rare Hunter run than a Yaksha run. Yaksha just does not feel good. He's in C tier, probably the worst skull in the game, I would say, which is a shame because we've all been looking forward to him for so long now. This is the big loser of the patch, right? The big loser of the game right now. I feel bad saying it, but he belongs at the bottom. And now on to some more uplifting news. Someone who doesn't belong on the bottom is Ghoul. Ghoul is up here in S tier. Ghoul is an S tier. Mad lad. The changes to Ghoul are phenomenal. I can't believe it. Much like the Warrior, much like the Water Skull, he's just received the best changes to bring him all the way up from the bottom. He was in C tier along with Water, I believe, in one of my previous lists, and he's climbed all the way up into S tier. The simple changes, right? And I was asking for this. You can go back and listen to all my previous Ghoul runs before the update. I was saying, please, let him get meat chunks in boss fights. It's his core mechanic of the meat chunks, and he can't use them in boss fights. So what did they do? We're gonna let you get meat chunks in boss fights, boyos, and you're gonna get that meat, and you're gonna get big and thick. Oh, what's that? You're getting hurt? Consume chunks. Fart cloud. Life back. You can't kill him, dude. You can't kill him. He is the snowball. Much like how Reaper snowballs magical damage, Ghoul snowballs physical damage. The more he kills, the more meat he gets. The more meat he gets, the more farts he does. The more farts he's doing, it tells you that he's healing a lot because he heals by digesting. The point is, he is just a wrecking ball of awesomeness now, and I love playing him. I used to not like playing him. It was like the Warrior and Ent. They felt boring and weak and lackluster, and their core mechanics weren't working. This is a good example of a core mechanic getting just the right changes to make it engaging and fun to use. He is just a joy. He is a joy. When playing with him, I feel like I'm a giant snowballing ghoul. You just want to go rah and run through enemies and bite them and eat them and cleave them up and get that meat in your belly, and then sit there and laugh tauntingly as foolish enemies try to take your life down. And then you consume, health back up, giant smoke cloud of doom, absolute stinkies, killing enemies for you. Baking in his grappling hook as a default feature Sensational idea. I love it. It just plays into his core mechanic even more now. It gives you more freedom with his abilities. You can use more of his kit. He's so good, dude. It's such a good way to design a skull. It's fantastic. S-tier skull, S-tier patchwork on skull. Well done, devs. God tier. And now that brings us towards the end of our tier list video. I'm sorry to those who were disappointed by the placements of some. However, do remember, this is the typical disclaimer that you hear in every single tier list video. This is my list. This is based on my experiences, which is why Gambler's an A tier. This is based on what I believe after my time playing since the update. Your lists might be completely different, and as a treat for that, I'm gonna leave the tier list maker for version 1.4 in the comments section below. Jump on there, whip up your own list, start sharing them in the Discord if you'd like, send them to me on Twitter. Share your opinions on what you think is correct or incorrect, or what you would do differently based on your list and your experiences. And just remember that this is mine, and that my opinion is better than yours. As it stands, I'm pretty happy with this list. I'm hoping that as time moves on and the new updates come out with things like the hard mode patch, that there might be some small work done to the skulls themselves. I know that items are going to get a touch up at some point as well, and these might shake up some of these skulls. This tier list is based both in the idea that these skulls function very well on their own and with items, by the way, for any of those curious. So I'm not putting, you know, Water Skull in S tier because full tactics Water Skull is amazing. It's just because Water Skull on his own is amazing, just so you know. And I'm also hoping that in the future we can see skulls like Yaksha rise to the occasion. This is, however, if I choose to keep Yaksha in C and not D, probably the first tier list I've done for Skull where there are no skulls in D tier. It's kind of the joke of the video. You might have noticed early on, D tier kind of just disappeared. There is no D. There is no D here, no D whatsoever, which I'm happy to say is a really, really good thing. It means that more of the skulls in the game are balanced. But with all of that said and done, I've got to get out of here. I hope you guys have enjoyed the new and improved Skull the Hero Slayer tier list. Remember to go down in the description and check out the tier list maker for yourselves, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one.